May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Our readings this week take an apocalyptic turn as we begin a 3-week period, sometimes known as the Advent before Advent. We are nearing the end of the church year, and that alone may signal a turn to completion. But as we consider creation's ultimate completion in Christ, let us not lose sight that the end towards which we journey is also a beginning. Much of what we begin today will echo through the weeks of Advent and be completed in the birth of Jesus, in the coming of Christ into the world. Our ending is our beginning. The reading from Matthew's Gospel today takes place in the aftermath of Jesus' confrontations with the scribes and the Pharisees in the temple. It's a few days before Passover, a few days before Jesus will be handed over to the authorities, and Jesus and his disciples are on the Mount of Olives, just to the east of the temple across the Kidron Valley. They're likely camping there, as Jerusalem by this point would have been quite crowded in the days leading up to the Passover festival. The disciples come to him, each of them privately, to ask, what will be the signs leading up to the end of times and Jesus' return? And thus marks the beginning of Jesus' fifth discourse, the apocalyptic discourse, which is where this parable comes from that we've read today. Now, it's important to realize that for the early Christians, Jesus' return was understood as an imminent reality. They expected it to happen in the very near future, in their lifetimes. This is the concern that Paul addresses in the letter to the Thessalonians today, as they are concerned about the fate of those who've died in the intervening time between the resurrection and Jesus returning. Written roughly 20 years after the resurrection, Paul's assurances to the Thessalonians would have addressed the very real concerns of these early followers of Jesus, these followers whose expectations were not met in their lifetime. There was an apparent delay in the Lord's arrival. Fast forward another 20 or 30, maybe 40 years, we're not really sure, but Jesus' followers, now comprising the community of Matthew, the community to whom Matthew is writing, and they're still waiting, still restless, still suffering under the burden of not knowing. They remain hopeful, steadfast in their faith, but nonetheless confused. Shouldn't Jesus be here by now? Fast forward nearly 2,000 years later, and here we are, still waiting, still pondering what Jesus' promised return means to us. Like those early followers of Jesus to whom Matthew and Paul first wrote, we know that Jesus' resurrection changed everything. It brought about a new age. Those early Christians would have told you, we are in fact, though against appearances, living in God's kingdom, a kingdom of truth and healing and grace. This is actually all present but hidden from unbelieving eyes and inaudible to unbelieving ears. That's the theology behind what's happening in our parable today. And it's a difficult truth in a world marked by violence and war. A world where just a week ago, 26 people died sitting in church like we are today. A world where just 6 weeks ago, 58 people were shot and killed and hundreds wounded in the massacre in Las Vegas. Not to mention the countless number lost to war and other acts of senseless violence and aggression all around the world. Jesus' resurrection may have ushered in a new age against all appearances, but shouldn't Jesus be here by now? That question is as timely today, perhaps more so, as it was 2,000 years ago. In the chapter preceding our parable today, Jesus addresses the concern that his return would come sooner than expected, that his followers may not be ready because they expect delay and lapse into idleness. Our parable today, the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, considers the other extreme, the difficulty of waiting. And that's something that many of us are not always so good at, especially when it comes to existential matters that are not so easily pinned down. Anglican priest and poet and noted birdwatcher R.S. Thomas once said, in discussing his determination to spot a rare species, waiting for birds is like waiting for God, but I don't think I would wait 3 hours for God. Waiting for God, waiting for what is not easily comprehended, the slipperiness of the holy, amidst the vagaries of a world not obviously redeemed, is hard. What does it even mean to wait in preparedness when we know not the day or the hour, and it's been 2,000 years? How are these texts relevant to us today? What does it mean? Every Tuesday, here in the Undercroft, in this building, a group of 8 or 10 people gather to sit in silence and wait. This is the meditation group. I'm able to only be here occasionally to sit in meditation with this group, but the practice is one that I've kept up personally for many years. Now, when I'm asked about this practice, about what one's supposed to achieve or what happens, I'm always a bit reluctant to answer, or maybe a bit unable to answer, because the experience lends itself more to doing than being talked about. It's something one needs to really experience and do and practice. But one of the things that I've come to understand over the years, and what is especially within my awareness as we move into this season of waiting, is that meditation, contemplative prayer, silent prayer, whatever you want to call it, is a practice of return. What happens in this silent prayer is an encapsulation of what happens in my consciousness on any given day. I drift far from the knowledge of God. I drift very far from the knowledge of God throughout the day, as I'm sure most of us do. God's presence is far from my awareness in the day-to-day routine of life. Then, at various points, by the grace of God, I'm reminded of God's presence, brought back to that place in myself where God dwells. And that's what happens in meditation. That's the practice. And it's encapsulated in this sitting every day, but it's something that happens in my larger experience too. Something that happens in all of our experiences, I believe. But being brought back to that place in myself where God dwells. Each of us has that God-shaped place at the core of our being. And our practices as Christians, our prayers, our meditation, our liturgy, all of that bring us back to that place where God waits for us. Where God waits for us. Not where we wait for God. Where God waits for us. This Advent before Advent is about waiting. Indeed, God is waiting for us. God has acted. and is waiting for our response, waiting for our return. 2 weeks ago at the diocesan convention, the theme was God is here, right now. And Bishop Lane said that a number of times throughout the day. And God is here right now. God will be very present to us in the Eucharist in just a bit that we're about to share. For we are living in the resurrection. And all things have been made new in Christ, just as those first Christians believed, and we believe today. What we do as Christians, our practice as Christians, not only our prayers and our liturgies, but also our love of one another, our love of stranger, is our response. All of that is our response to that knowledge that God is here. God is with us. And in those practices, we are called back. That's what religion does. The root word for religion, religar, means to bind back, to reconnect us to the holy presence from which we are so easily turned. The apocalyptic readings over the next few weeks point us to that revelation, and they call us to return to a place of hope, a place of healing and wholeness, in which we're all united and completed. That is our end. And it's now. It's right here, right now. This is our end. And it's also a beginning. And so I ask, what are we waiting for? That's the question to ponder, not only over these next 3 weeks, but over the full 4 weeks of Advent. What are we waiting for? What are you waiting for? Where is God waiting for you? Amen.